The scene begins not with noise, but with silence. A silence heavy with the weight of expectation. For in the halls of the United Nations, silence is often the loudest sound, the pause before the script unfolds, the interval in which diplomats sharpen their pens and prepare their applause for carefully staged compliance. Yet on this occasion that silence was destined to be broken, not by the words printed on 12 pages of carefully drafted statements, but by their rejection. A rejection that carried more power than all the signatures that had been missing from the document in the first place. For when Ibrahim Traoré, the young captain-turned-president from a landlocked West African nation, folded those pages and placed them into his pocket, rather than read them, he rewrote the script of history, turning what had been prepared as a moment of humiliation into a thunderclap of defiance. And to understand the magnitude of that moment, one must journey back into the machinery of pressure that had been building for weeks. The network of phone calls, memoranda, and veiled threats that had sought to corner him into submission. 2 months earlier, when he spoke candidly about Gaza and denounced French interference in Africa, the corridors of power in Paris, Washington, and Tel Aviv had stirred with unease, for here was a leader refusing the traditional diplomatic vocabulary of compromise, choosing instead the raw language of accusation, and those words judged too harsh, too severe, ignited a flurry of behind-the-scenes maneuvers, whispers of isolation, threats of aid withdrawal, reminders that small nations must know their place. What followed was a textbook example of international containment. First came the polite phone calls emphasizing partnership and cooperation, but carrying the undertone of warning. Second came the written demand, the infamous 12-page document stamped with the insignia of the United Nations. A text presented as a clarification request, but whose subtext was unmistakable. Retract. Apologize, and the matter would be closed. Yet anyone versed in the vocabulary of power understood that clarify meant to yield, partnership meant dependency, and responsible leadership meant silence in the face of injustice. Traoré knew this, his advisors knew this, and his people sensed it instinctively. For generations they had seen how aid was used not to heal, but to bind. How loans became chains rather than ladders. How security cooperation left the Sahel less secure with every passing year. The pressure escalated when an unannounced nocturnal visit brought the American ambassador to the presidential office in Ouagadougou, carrying a briefcase not of goodwill, but of threats masked as intelligence, spreading out reports on gold mines, Chinese contracts, Russian advisors, even medical partnerships with Iran, declaring surveillance as fact and insinuating that resistance would carry consequences. The message was brutal in its clarity. We know everything, therefore we can do anything. From that moment, the confrontation shifted from a dispute over words to a battle of sovereignties. Domination on one side and dignity on the other. And while international actors imagined that Burkina Faso would follow the well-trodden path of compliance, within the capital, a different strategy was already taking shape. A countermove as old as resistance itself, deception. Rumors were allowed to spread, whispers that the government was preparing to yield, that moderation had prevailed, that the apology would indeed be read at the United Nations. Western embassies relaxed, media outlets reported a softening of tone. CNN spoke of compromise, the BBC reported conciliation, and diplomatic cables framed the situation as under control. But in truth, the nation was preparing not for contrition, but for confrontation. Revolution Square filled with 50,000 citizens waving flags, singing songs of resistance. Elderly women with tears streaming down their faces because they had lived long enough to see defiance replace submission. And this crowd was not waiting for an apology. It was demanding sovereignty. In this contrast between perception abroad and reality at home lay the genius of the counter-strategy. For while international powers congratulated themselves on presumed success, the ground was shifting beneath their feet. Traoré consolidated his government, silencing internal voices urging moderation with a simple phrase. An apology today becomes a chain tomorrow. And thus discipline was restored. Direction was set. The illusion of compliance abroad bought time for defiance at home. And by the time the delegation boarded the plane to New York, two realities coexisted. The world believed an apology was imminent, but the nation prepared to roar its refusal. This paradox embodied the broader truth of asymmetrical politics. Material power may favor the mighty, but narrative power can tilt the balance. And so when the cameras switched on, and the assembly filled with more than 100 delegations waiting for the ritual of submission, the unexpected unfolded. He walked to the podium with no papers in his hand, no notes, no sign of compliance. And in the stunned silence of expectation, he delivered his first line. Before asking me to apologize, let me ask you, how many times have you apologized to Africa? The translators hesitated, their voices trembling as they repeated the words. And instantly, the balance of the hall shifted. The arbiters became defendants. The powerful were forced to confront their own unspoken guilt. And the ceremony of discipline collapsed into a theater of accusation. For 3 hours, he spoke without script, summoning the ghosts of Congo, Algeria, Gaza. Each name a scar opened before the assembly, each example a demand for accountability rather than apology. And with every sentence, the authority of the 12 drafted pages shrank further into irrelevance. This was not Burkina Faso alone speaking. It was the echo of centuries, the voice of generations denied the microphone of history, and now amplified before the world. The symbolism was devastating. A young captain from a landlocked nation confronting empires with nothing but his voice, discarding 12 prepared pages in exchange for 3 hours of improvised truth. And the numbers themselves became a metaphor. 12 pages demanded, 3 hours delivered, 12-3. A ratio that encapsulated the reversal of power, the triumph of authenticity over coercion. Delegations fidgeted, some looked down in discomfort. Others nodded quietly in solidarity. African states felt a surge of recognition. Diaspora communities watching from afar erupted in pride, and though applause was hesitant, the silence itself carried the weight of acknowledgement. What had been designed as a humiliation became an indictment of the system itself, and in that transformation lay the seed of a new narrative, one that could not be erased by sanctions or editorials. Observers called it sovereignty in its purest form, not negotiated, not mediated, not footnoted, but spoken raw and unfiltered. And in that hall, in that moment, history bent, for even if consequences would follow, the precedent of defiance had been set.